experience is that Dmitry Andreikin, he has candidates tournament experience against the very best players in the world. He's won so many Title Tuesdays now, and now he needs to take down Denis Lazavik to return to the Speed Chess Championship. But one of these two will be a deserving winner and will get onto the main stage of the Speed Chess Championship, along with the likes of Magnus Carlsen, Hikaru Nakamura, Fabiano Caruana, and others. So we see here a check on b4. We're getting into some classical territory. This is the Catalan, and so many illustrious players have chosen this as their main opening weapon. Here, knight h5 kicks that bishop from f4 back to f6. We will not see the draw, will we? So this bishop can go back and forth from c1 to f4, but not in this game. Instead, we see a pawn push and some knight development from white up in the center with e4. And in positions like this, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not even sure. But sometimes black is supposed to play c5. Other times it's a terrible move. So Andreikin, he transitions this one into more of like a French-like position, but it looks bad from the black side. I mean, this bishop is not good. You can't play c5 because you drop a pawn. And if I'm not mistaken, in some of these positions, white actually plays c5 before black is able to. Even if it costs you a pawn, you want to shut down this bishop on b7. So here, knight e5 is very tempting to my eyes. But perhaps there's like a queen c7 there. Still some things to work out for both of these players. And Andreikin, he's a little bit behind on the clock. Now it's about to even up. But I like white's position, much more space, a free hand in the center. But Andreikin, he's solid. That's the thing about his position. All of his pawns, well, not the a-pawn, but his other pawns have defenders, and they're not that easy to get to and try and win. Whereas white's center here, this d4 pawn later in the game could potentially become a target. So we see bishop e5 played rather than knight to e5, queen e7. I think what I like from Andreikin's perspective is he's making moves quickly. And now c5 is the question. There is no tension between bishops, which is usually the downfall of these c5 moves. c5 takes. Okay, you keep taking. White does get this outside pawn majority, 3-on-2. But that's a long story. That's something that we talk about in the endgame. But for the moment, we have queens on the board, rooks on the board, and so it doesn't look like a problem. So c5 has, in fact, been played. Liquidation, and here we go. Step one. If we get more liquidation here, I don't think that Dmitry's going to mind. And something to point out, that bishop takes f3 sometimes is a threat. So it didn't happen. The knight moved to e5. But there are times when you play against the light square bishop because there's nothing on this diagonal, as the knight can sometimes outclass a bishop in these structures, especially with these pawns. So instead we see a rook trade being offered, rook takes rook, and rook d1 is in fact possible. It looks like it blunders a piece. Isn't that knight on e5 hanging? There's a back rank checkmate at the end that black needs to keep an eye on. So as we approach this in endgame, white's chances actually do improve somewhat because you have these pawns here all the way on the queen side, 3 versus 2. That means that black's pieces often get distracted trying to stop a pass pawn. And here, Dmitry, he has played his move rook to d8, and it's Denis who is thinking, now down over 30, soon to be 40 seconds against Dmitry. And it looks like there's a glow on Denis here. He's got just like a little bit of brightness, on his face. I don't know if that's from the computer or from the sun outside. But right now we see rook d1 played, very practical. Going for this back rank checkmate. The knight on e5 cannot be touched. It is immune to capture unless you want to get back rank checkmated. So, yeah, we see here that white trying to go after the back rank, trying to force pieces off the board, trying to win certain endgames because of this outside pawn, extra pawn. Black's extra pawn is in the middle, and you can hear me saying extra pawn for one side, extra pawn for the other. It's even material, 6 pawns each, but you have to look at it like that because if the rooks and the queens leave the board, white will be trying to push the pass pawn here, and black will eventually be trying to push the pass pawn here. Whose do you think is faster? Come on, chat, you can do this. White usually is faster, because it just takes a few pawn pushes to get a passed pawn. Black's takes a bunch over here, and you need to make all this work. It's a very long story, and White's king is already close to that action. So Andreikin, he's not sure. Do I trade rooks? He does, in fact, trade rooks right now, and there is a threat of queen d8 check. It's not mate because the black queen can slide back, but that was checkmate if you, in fact, took on e5, because then you wouldn't have the queen to block with. So g6 played. I like that move. And for Denis, the question is, do you go in with your queen, or do you play solidly? Queen to e2 protects your knight, keeps your a2 pawn defended over here. Queen d8 check. The king goes up to g7. You have to take care of your knight. I don't know. I don't think f4 is the type of move you want to play. It opens up your king. But it's not completely out of the question because the knight on e5 is so strong. Also, wait a second. Queen d8. I'm going to show you something quickly. Queen d8. King g7. Queen f6. King f6. Knight d7. You get your queen back. But this is bad for, I don't know which way, for white, because here, these two pawns take care of these three pawns. No longer do you have a passed pawn. I can shut you down here. And black, on the other hand, has mobile pawns in the center. So this is a good way to lose the game rather than win. So in the game, we saw queen e2 and queen e3, played by Denis Lazavik. It's a deep concept, or maybe not that deep. Let's trade the queens. By the way, queen d6, queen h6 check is a cheeky move. It doesn't actually win material because the king goes to g8. But queen h6, I was just about to point out, white's best move in the position would be queen to h8 check, because the black king would take it, and then there would be a fork on f7. So queen h6, king g8, queen back to f4, or something like that. He starts with queen f4. I'm just trying to think if there was a tactic there. No, the tactics didn't quite work out in white's favor, but I had to look at the ceiling, look up to see if the position would come to me. So queen f4 played. In some positions, knight takes g6 is a threat because the queens would stare at each other and the knight could recapture, but the queen has this check. So checks, captures, threats. You want to think about all of those. h6. So queen takes h6. He walked into the same plan, but it's worse in this time. You take the pawn. Dmitry Andreikin, a rare blunder, and it's a mutual oversight. Oh, look, Andreikin sees it now. He sees it. You saw his face? He found it after the move. So this is not the first time today where Dmitry laughs afterwards because there was a mistake. And I don't know if Denis Lazavik has seen it. Just to show everybody, h6, blunder, blue arrow, take the pawn. It's even better now for white because you get this fork. I was trying to give away the queen without the pawn being there because the f7 pawn drops. White would be up 2 pawns here. And if you give away this pawn and go king g8, you've just allowed this plan that I mentioned earlier. Andreikin is laughing. He is still laughing. He can't believe the blunder that he made, but this would have been a classy finish to the game and an unfortunate one for Andreikin. But Denis Lazavik is going to be kicking himself because now we have a dynamic where white remains better. The queen has fully centralized. The black king in the line of sights. Knight g4, perhaps a threat, but the queen can slide to e7. So I'm never quite sure what's actually a threat here. And king h7, escaping the pin. I disagree with the question mark, but white's moves, c5, c6. This is what I've been telling you about, everyone, that the idea for white, the pushing of the passed pawn is much easier to make work, whereas black's passed pawn is actually blockaded by the knight in the center. So c5 can be played, but you do open up this b file here for the black queen. There also will be knight g4 ideas, knight g4 ideas thanks to this pawn being on h5. So you have to think about when that works out for black or not. a4 played. Not really sure the benefit of playing a4, but still, pawns go forward. King goes back. And is a5 the move? Is c5 the move? I'm not sure how white is going to proceed. I'd imagine c5, but that does give black this d5 square as well, so it's a trade-off. Queen f4 is listed as the move, and the reason why is knight takes g6 is available. The knight on f6 is hanging, and if the king goes to g7, knight g6 protects the queen. The queens are in a stare down over here, so the queen f4 arrow is not mine, but if it's played, the game will go in Denis Lazavik's favor. I think that queen f4 is findable for him, but he just needs to spot knight takes g6 as the follow-up, and the white king is on the perfect square. No longer is it on this diagonal where black could sidestep with a check. 53 seconds for white. Will he play queen f4? Will he play c5 or b5 or a5? White is spoiled for choice. That's the good news for Lazavik as he approaches 40 seconds and his time is ticking. Andreikin, he has to respond to move b5, so he's lucky he didn't drop a pawn, but now he gives up a pawn. Knight takes, pawn takes, queen g4, white steals a pawn, but black is trying to get active, trying to make him like queen d6 or queen c5 and get into the heart of the white position. So white down to about 25 seconds, black at 22 seconds himself. Knight goes into c6. I don't want your pawn on the king side. I want your a7 pawn. Give it to me. a5 comes to mind as move, but then c5. You're going to power through, push through, create a passer. e5 played. And now queen d8. That's an all-star move from Denis Lazavik. The queens are gone, which means that a7 is just falling. He takes f7. He has this knight g5 idea. Don't play f3 because e2 and the king couldn't get through. But instead, knight comes back to d6. Think the white king can come to f2. 18 seconds for Lazavik, 5 seconds for Andreikin. This knight goes to b2. So you need to be sure. You need to step carefully. There are some squares that you don't want to be on, hitting both these pawns. But a5, if takes c5, then a4. These are things that you need to calculate. 7 seconds for Lazavik. He's not sure. a5 was not. He goes king e4, giving up the a4 pawn to run his king to b7. Or no, he goes after the knight. But now the black king steps in the other direction. But knight c8 takes, and knight takes b6. That is such good recognition. Great awareness from Lazavik. 1 second for Andreikin. He brings his knight back to d7. After knight b6, king c5. He's barely getting off the moves. Is Andreikin. Here comes c7, and he loses on time. Andreikin's lost over the board. He loses on the clock. Denis Lazavik missed maybe one of the more basic tactics